What's going on? It's our last week before break. We're still in the middle of Unit 5, Cognition, so about our thinking. This particular video is going to be about something called intelligence. It's a word we use a lot, so we're going to talk about what exactly that means and why it's so hard to understand. We're going to talk about the history of intelligence research and different types of intelligence as well. So to talk about the history of this word, intelligence, we have to start with this guy, Francis Galton, pretty ugly dude. We start with Galton because he was the first person who really became well known for saying that your intelligence is tied to your genetics, meaning your genes. You inherit it from your parents. That's what he believed. He actually wrote this book called Hereditary Genius. This word hereditary means that it's inherited. You get it from your biological parents, and they got it from your grandparents, and so on and so forth. Now, this can be a dangerous idea because it actually led to him becoming what we call the father of eugenics. If you've heard this word eugenics, it's the idea that only certain people should be allowed to have kids. He believed, in the time that he was writing, that only rich white people were smart. And he thought that only rich white people should have kids. Eugenics, he said, it's the study of social control to improve racial qualities of future generations. Guess who really liked this book? Who is well known for believing that only certain types of people should be allowed to live and have kids and reproduce to create a superior race? Yeah, Hitler was a big fan of Francis Galton's work. Hitler was a eugenicist. He believed that, for example, that the Jewish people, or that many minorities, should not be allowed to have kids, and in some cases not even be allowed to live. That idea came from Francis Galton, who thought that only certain people were smart and that those people passed on their smartness to their kids. Okay? Pretty problematic. So the history of intelligence has always been controversial. Now, moving along to this next guy, Alfred, everyone say Binet. It's a French name, Binet. Have you ever had beignets? Binet. Alfred Binet and his partner Simone, his research partner, said that there should be a way to actually measure intelligence. They didn't believe it was just about how smart your parents were, but they believed that different people could be smart, and they wanted to figure out how to measure this. So they actually want to help teachers out by testing kids to see whether teachers had gotten better at teaching and kids had gotten better at learning. So they developed the first intelligence test that was for French kids because they were French, and it was measuring what they called mental age. So this French IQ test to measure how smart kids were to see if their teachers were doing a good job or not. Now, an American guy found out about this test. He found out about the Binet IQ test, and he wanted to make an American version of it. Now, he taught at Stanford University. So this test would become known, it was like the English version of the Binet test, but it became known as the Stanford Binet. Okay? So the Binet test came first, and then he developed the Stanford Binet. So Binet did not do the Stanford Binet. That was a guy named Lewis Terman. And he wasn't just using it for kids. He actually used this because he also believed that eugenics was a true thing, that some races were smarter than others. So he actually used this test on people who were trying to come into the United States. He only wanted to let smart people who scored high on this English IQ test into the United States, which is a problem, obviously. And then he also used it to test soldiers to figure out what types of men made good officers and made good soldiers, and who should get what types of roles and be promoted. So, some problematic things in this for sure. What's most important about Lewis Terman is that he's the one who developed this formula, and I'll put a star by it, where he said that to get your IQ, we take your mental age, meaning how well you do on this test, whether you test like a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old or a 20-year-old. He said, if we divide it by your actual age, or what we sometimes refer to as your chronological age, like just based on your birthday, and then we take this number, you get some sort of a decimal, and we multiply it by 100, okay? So, the fun thing about this is the average IQ is a 100, right? So, if you test like a 15-year-old, and you are 15 years old, 15 divided by 15 is 1. 1 times 100 means your average for your age. Now, if you test like a 20-year-old and you're only 15, well, this is going to be a number higher than 1. So your IQ will be greater than 100 after we move the decimal over 2 spaces. On the flip side, if you test like a 10-year-old, even though you were 15, well, 10 divided by 15, that's going to be a decimal lower than 1. So your IQ will be lower than 100. So Louis Terman is the guy who came up with this formula for thinking about what IQ means. So this test that he would give would have questions like this. And then you have to try and figure out which picture belongs in the square. So we'll look at an example of these IQ tests, and you can kind of see, do you think this is a good reflection of actual intelligence or not? All right. So let's look at that formula again. IQ equals mental age divided by chronological age times 100. So this first question says, Susie is 10 years old, so that's her chronological age, but her intelligence test shows that she has the abilities of a 13-year-old. So her mental age is 13. What is her IQ? Well, we do 13 divided by 10, which ends up being 1.3. We multiply that by 100. We would say that Susie has an IQ of 130. Here's a different way of doing the math. Bobby has an IQ of 80. We know he is 5 years old. That's his chronological age. Well, what is his mental age? Well, this is now like algebra, y'all. We divide both sides by 100. So we get 0.8 equals x over 5. Now we have to multiply both sides by 5 to get the x by himself. Okay? So we would say that Bobby, his mental age is 4. Right? So he is 5, but when you took the test, he tested like a 4-year-old. Okay? Number 3 here for Andre. So his IQ is 125. He has a mental age of 15. So now we're trying to solve for how old he actually is. So I would divide both sides by 100 to get 1.25 equals whatever. Give me a second here. All right, we got 1.25 equals 15 over x. So basically what I ended up doing is put the x over here, divide both sides by 1.25, and then that would give me my answer. I think this is really bad math, but you get how it works, okay? Make sure you can answer these 3 questions. You might see them on a quiz that could be on the test as well. Let's move on to part 2, types of intelligence, okay? So what some researchers more recently have proposed is that there's not one type of intelligence. Now, Charles Spearman said yes, there was. He said that there's what he called general intelligence. He called it the G factor. Spearman said one type of intelligence, like if you're good at one thing, you're going to be good at everything else. So if you're good at math, you'll be good at language arts, and you'll be good with people, and you'll be good at sports, and you'll be good at music. Like some people are smart, some people are not. That was his big idea, just general intelligence. Other folks have come along and said, no. There's different ways, different types of intelligence. So a guy named David Wechsler, last name starts with a W, he created 2 tests. A test for adults, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and he also created a test for kids, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, the WAIS and the WISC. And we'll look at some of these problems in class so you can kind of get a feel for how he measured intelligence. It was about like problem solving and application. Another way of thinking about intelligence, a guy named Sternberg said that there's actually 3 types of intelligence. He said you can be book smart, what he called analytical intelligence, math and problem solving. But he said that some people are creatively intelligent. They're good at art and music, coming up with new ideas. He said some folks are practically intelligent. They have street smarts. They have common sense, okay? So here's another way of thinking about this. Analytic intelligence, okay? Being able to solve problems and figure things out. Practical intelligence, being able to build, create, use your hands, use skills in the real world. And then creative intelligence, inventing and designing. Think about which of these 3 you think that might be your strongest form of intelligence. Now, Daniel Goleman added in a 4th type of intelligence. He proposed emotional intelligence. So this graphic over here says that they've done some research. They found that people in the workplace, that 58% of their job performance, it comes from their emotional intelligence. How good they are understanding their own emotions and reading other people's emotions. In fact, they have found that people with higher EQ, emotional intelligence, they make on average about $29,000 a year more than someone with low emotional intelligence. So you don't need to write this down, but emotional intelligence is your ability to be aware of your own emotions and to manage your own emotions. And then it's also your ability to be aware of other people's emotions through things like empathy, and then to manage sort of those interpersonal other people relationships. So being able to influence others, work in teams, deal with conflicts with other people. So this is what Daniel Goleman said was the most important form of intelligence. You're like, well, that's 4 types of intelligence, Mr. Jones. That's a lot. Well, Howard Gardner actually said that there are 8 forms of intelligence, okay? Multiple intelligences. These are not the same as learning styles. It's different ways of being smart about things. So we'll take a test. I'll show you the link in a little bit here. We'll take a test in class where we're going to talk about language intelligence and logical intelligence and visual and how you understand yourself, how you understand others, musical movement, and your ability to understand nature. So think about which of these might be the thing that you are best at. 7 questions here. These are all about people. Who proposed which idea? Make sure that you can answer these questions right. Pause it and give it a try. So our third section out of 4, just some vocabulary related to intelligence. So first off, psychometrics. And this is what our next homework is going to be about. It's going to be the study of how we measure intelligence. All right, so psycho has to do with the mind. Metrics has to do with how we measure the mind. So this is a whole field of psychology that you can go into if you want to be a kind of psychologist who gives IQ tests, personality tests, things like that. Okay. The 2 things we're measuring: aptitude and achievement. So the way that we used to think about these 2 words are that aptitude was about your future. Aptitude was supposed to predict how you would do in the future. So when the SAT came out way back in the day, it was the Scholastic Aptitude Test. It was supposed to measure, for a high schooler, how good they would do in college. It was supposed to predict the future. It was more about how you think in general. In contrast, the ACT was supposed to be an achievement test. And the ACT was originally more about what had you learned in the past. So aptitude, how well can you learn going forward? Achievement, how well have you learned previously? In reality, these 2 tests are now pretty similar. They're both testing a mix of aptitude, and they're both pretty heavy on achievement as well. But there is a difference between those 2 words. There's also a difference between what's called fluid intelligence, fluid, like a liquid, and crystallized intelligence, like a solid. Crystallized intelligence, I always say, if you don't mind writing the word crossword, crystallized starts with a CR. Doing a crossword puzzle, also starting with CR. Not a word search, y'all. A crossword puzzle, where like they give you a fact or a definition, and you have to come up with the word. Crystallized intelligence is just you have all these facts crystallized, stuck in your brain. What year was the Declaration of Independence written? Okay. Who was president during the Vietnam War? Right. Knowing all these facts and dates and names. Old people, I'm going to write old here. Old people are really good at crystallized intelligence. They're good at like shows like Jeopardy, right? There's like all this like random trivia, these facts stuck in their minds. In contrast, fluid intelligence is about, I'm going to write the word fast. I'm going to write the word young. It's about being able to respond to new situations, adapt to new forms of technology, play a video game, reaction time, sports, hand-eye coordination. When you're younger, y'all's age, y'all are way better at fluid intelligence, things that involve speed, reacting, etc. Whereas older folks are better at crystallized intelligence, just like the accumulation of facts over time. It's 2 different types of intelligence. One other term I want you to know about is called the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect. The researcher's name was Mr. Flynn, and what he found was that society over time has actually gotten smarter. So he looked at IQ tests in a lot of different areas. fluid intelligence, how quickly you respond to things, crystallized intelligence, facts in your brain, overall G intelligence, spatial intelligence. He found that over time, society has gotten smarter. We'll talk about why that might be in class. Our last section for today is about what happens if you're on the extremes of intelligence. So if you're at the high extreme of intelligence, we have a word for folks, we say the word gifted. Okay? What that means is that they tested with an IQ of at least 130. They're in the top 2 or 3% of test takers. Okay? Now, you can be even smarter than gifted. Genius is the top 0.25%, meaning they get an IQ of 145, 3 standard deviations above the mean. We'll talk about what that means in our next class, okay? But gifted and genius, and the reason why these people are so smart, we don't know exactly, but we do know that they have more gray matter, meaning their association areas, their Wernicke's area and Broca's area, and their temporal lobe and their prefrontal cortex. Those areas are more developed, and also they just look like they have more connection in their brain. Their neurons have fired and wired together more, so they have more gray matter and more white matter. On the other side of the intelligence extreme, we have folks who score low. Okay, so the technical term for someone with a low mental ability is called intellectual disability. Okay, it used to be called mental retardation. That is a clinical psychological definition for somebody who scores below a 70 on their IQ test. And also, this is important, put a star by it, it also has to be someone who has trouble living a normal life. What they found was that if your IQ is super low, if it's 50 or 60, but you can have a job and date and live by yourself, you would not be diagnosed with a disability. The disability diagnosis is that you are unable to live on your own, to totally function on your own. You have difficulty compared to other people. Okay? We don't use this R word to just refer to folks. Okay? Make sure that we do not use this as a slur. It's offensive. This is a technical psychological term and a diagnosis for someone who has a brain issue. All right? So similar things that can affect intelligence. You may have heard of Down syndrome. That's a genetic disorder where you have an extra bit of chromosome 21. We also have these cases where someone appears to have incredibly low intelligence, but also has some sort of a talent and unique ability. And so I'll actually share some of these videos with y'all at some point, just of folks who we call savants, savant syndrome, when they have low functioning intelligence. They could be diagnosed with an intellectual disability, but they also have some amazing skill. Okay? So really interesting things to think about how the brain works on the extremes of intelligence. Make sure that you can answer these questions. We'll go over all the checks for understanding and then talk about some of these other examples in class. Okay? Appreciate y'all.